Friday, Tom Perez, the newly anointed chair of the DNC, you know, the party that lost the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, called the 45th president of the United States a bully and someone who didn't really win the election. In fact, Perez was a bit more exorcised in his rant. Take a listen.
We have a bully in Washington in the White House. Donald Trump, you don't stand for our values. That's what they said. Donald Trump, you didn't win this election. Donald Trump, that romance you have with Putin, it's not going to do you any good. Donald Trump, we will resist.
Don't stand for our values? Pray tell, Perez, what are our values and what is it that you want us to resist? Law and order, the letter of the law, the Constitution, the plenary powers of the president to protect Americans? I have a prediction to make. While the left acts like children who just can't get over the fact that Hillary lost the election and simply won't stop their abusive invectives against the man who was constitutionally elected, yes, that's what I said, constitutionally elected, calling him not legitimate and his cabinet scumbags, that man is doing the job we hired him to do. He is building up and modernizing the military as well as strengthening law enforcement. With General John Kelly, he is ridding this country of some of the most dangerous elements who simply don't belong here and weren't allowed here in the first place, like MS-13, illegal gang members who swear an oath to kill others, the ones the liberal lefty mayors want to keep here, risking the safety of their own law-abiding American citizens. And with General James Mattis, the military is poised to destroy those cockroaches known as ISIS in Iraq and Syria, just as President Trump promised. Imagine a president who not only does what he says, but can actually figure out what the end goal is, as opposed to President Obama, whose feckless foreign policy was to have no strategy and who graduated to contain ISIS and then decides to degrade and destroy them, all of which, of course, never happened. And all the while, these namby-pamby wusses obsessing that Russia interfered with our election and our democracy. But these bozos still haven't figured out what exactly Russia did. But they must have done something because Queen Hillary should have been coronated. Instead of admitting that the woman was so desperate for power that she sets up a private server to both collect money and run the government, and you know the rest. And by the way, the Russians didn't write her emails, the ones that sunk her. She did. And by the way, the Russians didn't give Hillary the questions before the CNN debate. Donna Brazile did. And nobody seems to care or want to investigate that Barack Obama danced with the devil in Tehran, whose people cut off our heads because we're infidels, the ones who yell death to America, the ones he gave $150 billion to and another $400 million that they thought they could quietly get away with. So while they moan and groan about blowing up the White House in March and shout down the people on the right and literally try to suppress our free speech by burning down our buildings, our president is doing what we hired him to do. He's building up the military. He's dealing with the greatest historical threat that confronts America today, the threat of North Korea backed by China. North Korea with Kim Jong-un at its head, whose relatives all fear walking over a bridge in case it opens up and the piranhas end up eating them, and who, by all accounts, is as unbalanced as Barack Obama's budget. And so my prediction? If and when the clash of the Titans does come, these wimps, the one who will never give up their airplane seat for someone in the military, the ones who demand that they speak and shout you down so you can't, and who will never pay the price to speak, will be the first to pee in their pants and run under their desks and will thank their lucky stars that President Donald J. Trump and his generals have the guts and the instincts to put on their big boy pants every morning and face the reality of the real danger that is confronting America today. And that's my open. Tell me what you think on my Facebook page or Twitter, hashtag Judge Jeanine.
Fake news and media bias, those are the topics of tonight's Waters Words. On the fake news front, an embarrassing disaster for the mainstream media, as usual. The press breathlessly reporting that House Intelligence Committee Chairman Devin Nunes received evidence that Trump figures were surveilled and unmasked by White House officials.
Two senior White House officials saying that
at least two White House officials.
Two White House staffers, two people who worked in the White House.
But when asked about whether this was true or not, the chairman said this.
We're not going to get into sources and methods. I mean, if not, who's going to ever come to our committee? But I can tell you that those reports are mostly wrong.
Okay, so after a week of blanket coverage on the story, it turns out the reporting was inaccurate, but the damage had already been done. Another story that made the rounds this week, the Washington Post said this about the new Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. Many career diplomats say they still have not met him, and some have been instructed not to speak to him directly or even make eye contact. So the Washington Post is trying to tell us that State Department officials have been told not to look Tillerson in the eye? What is he, Jennifer Lopez? This guy was the CEO of ExxonMobil for 10 years. He's not a diva. Anybody who read this knew it was phony. And to his credit, Ace State Department reporter Matt Lee shot down this bogus report, saying people have been shopping him this BS for months, and it was a complete fabrication. Another outright fabrication involves, who else? Donald Trump. When the president met with German Chancellor Angela Merkel the other day, the Times of London alleged this. Donald Trump handed the German Chancellor Angela Merkel a bill thought to be for more than 300 billion pounds for money her country owed NATO for defending it when they met last weekend. This spread like wildfire to places like Politico, The Hill, Slate. But guess what? More fake news. A spokesman for Merkel said this. Reports that President Trump had presented the federal chancellor with a kind of bill with a concrete billion sum are not true. These types of fake news stories are why the media has such little credibility anymore, and why when the media reports on serious issues like Russian hacking or approval ratings, the public doubts their veracity. It's clear what this is all about. Fictitious and trivial reporting that's used for clicks and partisan politics. Moving on to media bias. This week was an especially bad week, but I feel like I say that every week. Sean Spicer delivered a clever zinger at a briefing on Tuesday.
If the president puts Russian salad dressing on his salad tonight, somehow that's a Russian connection.
Spicer's got jokes. But the humorless folks over at CNN, you know what they did? They fact-checked the joke. Thing is, Russian dressing isn't Russian. Also, it's really not for salads, but more of a sandwich spread, usually a Reuben. Russian dressing typically is served with corned beef, Swiss, and sauerkraut on a Reuben sandwich. The mayo and ketchup concoction, often dressed up with horseradish and spices, was created in Nashua, New Hampshire. Ooh. Guys, you just fact-checked Russian dressing. Take a lap. Here's another one. The Trump White House unveiled their Easter eggs for the White House Easter egg roll. So they got a bunch of colors, and they have gold ones. And the New York Times decided to mock the gold eggs as Trumpian. New York Times reporter Julie Davis tweeting, "Forget those silly pastel rainbow colors of White House Easter egg rolls past. Trump's Easter eggs will be gold." But moments later, our friend Julie at the Times had to issue a little bit of a retraction. "Appears my memory of Easter egg rolls past was wrong. Seems Obama's had a golden egg too, not a Trump innovation." Hey, Julie, next time, don't judge an egg by its color. And finally, dear old Chris Matthews over at MSNBC compared Jared and Ivanka Trump to the sons of brutal dictator Saddam Hussein.
Let me just say, you know, I kid about everything, but, you know, Uday Qusay working for Saddam Hussein, you couldn't go to a restaurant and have eye contact with one of these guys without getting killed. Well, these people are really powerful. Imagine getting into a fight in the office with Jared or Ivanka. Well, they have enormous power, and they're always going to be there.
Has Chris Matthews ever compared Chelsea to bin Laden's son? We checked the archives, have not found anything yet. So when it comes to bias, it's clear the press is out to smear President Trump and everything he's associated with. When Easter eggs and condiments are used as weapons to damage the White House, it's clear the press has gone mad. Bottom line, we're on to you. Joining me now, conservative author and columnist Ann Coulter. Ann, welcome to Water's World. It's glad to finally have you on the show.
Good to be here.
Let me ask you a question. You know, these Democratic mayors, they use these federal funds to buy votes, to, you know, hand out pork and patronage. Are we naive to believe that, you know, withholding a few $1 million is going to stop this out-of-control behavior? Because they'll just keep spending and spending and spending. You think more needs to be done?
A lot more federal funds could be withheld. Congress may need to pass a law to allow other federal funds to be withheld. There are certain categories of them that the Attorney General is able to withhold. But, I mean, the IRS used tax policy to dictate the dating policies at Bob Jones University. Oh, no, the federal government can have a very big impact on not only private schools, but cities and towns. I mean, remember, it was Liddy Dole who changed the national speed limit to 55 miles an hour by threatening to give them highway funds. But the supremacy clause of the Constitution that says federal laws are supreme over state law, it's treated like a ratchet. So if it's a federal law liberals like we shall have one national abortion law. Abortion will be legal. That must be enforced. Or the gay marriage ruling. By the way, these aren't laws. These are mere Supreme Court opinions. Down to, you know, some poor little Kentucky clerk. The next day, they're demanding she issue the gay marriage license. But when it comes to things that are, by definition, laws that the federal government ought to be dealing with, immigration. I mean, you can't contain immigration to a single city or a single state. They can walk around. They can go from one town to the next to kill people. Of course, that's immigration, as the Supreme Court has ruled over and over again, and liberals reminded us with Arizona. Of course, immigration is a federal responsibility.
Could you imagine if local jurisdictions disregarded federal law on guns? Or on abortion, or on drugs.
Tax law.
Or tax law. Imagine, you know, we're going to collect the local and then the city and the state tax. We're not really going to hand over any federal taxes. I mean, the hell that would rain down on those cities and states would be unbelievable. But when Democrats do it in these precincts, it's noble. Total double standard.
That's actually, that's a great idea because I've noticed liberals never understand or pretend to never understand how corrupt their principles are until we turn around and apply it to them. I mean, we're seeing it right now with the rule on how many votes are needed to confirm a judge. Now suddenly, they're outraged that we might change it to 51 for the Supreme Court. Well, they changed it to 51 for every position except the Supreme Court. And sexual harassment laws under Bill Clinton. I mean, I defended cases where bosses would get in trouble for having a picture of their own wives wearing a bikini on their desks. That was considered sexual harassment. But Bill Clinton dropping his pants and saying, kiss it. Suddenly they realized perhaps we should roll back some of this sexual harassment law.
And your concept, because you're an attorney as well, tell me if this you think is going to work. What if they allow these wrongful death suits to go forward and say Kate Steinle's family sues the pants off San Francisco and Mayor Ed Lee, and some judge or some jury slaps the city with a judgment to the tune of, $10, $20, $30 million wrongful death? You think that's a possibility?
Yeah, actually, I've never heard anyone suggest that, but that seems like a great idea. I mean,
well, I have a brilliant legal mind. What can I say?
Yeah. New York City pays out tens of millions of dollars. You ought to look that up every year for,
the police brutality and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and That's government action, and they're just writing checks every day.
That's true.
Or I don't know, every month.
That is
so
true.
yeah, it seems to me the same principle applies.
All right, so I think we're on something. And Ann, I'm going to hold you over for the next segment because we're going to talk about how this Russia story could potentially backfire on the left.
Right now to a story we've been following. Police have arrested 3 people in connection to a fire that led to parts of the Interstate 85 to collapse, shutting down one of Atlanta's main traffic arteries. Our own Brian Yennis has the very latest on that story. Hi, Brian.
Hi, Elizabeth. Well, the man accused of starting the raging fire that collapsed a portion of Interstate 85 just north of downtown Atlanta was in court this morning. Basil Ellaby now faces charges of first-degree arson as well as first-degree criminal damage to property. His bond is set at $200,000. This isn't Ellaby's first run-in with the law either. Ellaby has an extensive criminal record, arrested more than a dozen times since 1995, mostly drug charges. In fact, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution is reporting the defendant smoked crack before starting this fire. 2 others are believed to be with Ellaby when he set the highway on fire are charged with criminal trespass. The Interstate 85 inferno broke out on Thursday afternoon in an area used to store construction materials. Authorities still won't say how the fire was started or why it started. And the flames, you can see, are just thick black smoke shot into the air. Look at this Instagram video from a driver. Dozens of firefighters battled the blaze as they dodged flying concrete. The fire's temperatures were so high, this portion of the highway collapsed. Amazingly, no one was injured. When it was all said and done, the fire devoured 350 feet of Interstate 85 that will now need to be replaced in both directions. This is an important stretch of highway that carries about 400,000 cars a day through Atlanta. Now, a city already known for its traffic woes will have nightmarish traffic for the foreseeable future.
We expect the demolition of these damaged sections to last throughout this weekend and into Monday. The big question on everyone's mind is, how long will this take to repair? We're not able to give you a firm estimate at this moment, but you should know that this will take at least several months to get this rebuilt.
As for the cost, we still don't have any idea, but the federal government is pitching in to help. The U.S. Department of Transportation gave already $10 million for the initial repair work. Elizabeth?
Ooh, I'm telling you something, Brian. That traffic's no joke. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Well, it seems with President Donald Trump in the White House, the United Nations could be in for a bit of a change. So says our new ambassador, Nikki Haley, who assumes the presidency of the Security Council today for the month of April. You know, she's been on the job for just over 2 months and says the administration has already chalked up some successes at the world body. Their goal, she says, is to try and reform the UN to better face the threats we all now face. I sat down with the ambassador for our exclusive Fox News interview, and we talked at the United States mission to the UN about her new role.
She went from the South Carolina governor's desk to a seat on the United Nations Security Council.
We need to be concerned about chemical weapons use in Syria.
And as president of it this month, Nikki Haley, the new United States ambassador to the United Nations, brings a blunt message to the UN from the Trump administration.
And what we're trying to do is say, okay, it's a new day at the UN.
That new day, she says, will focus on human rights, UN peacekeeping, the UN budget, and working to correct the wrongs that have plagued the world body.
We just need the United States to lead again. I mean, think about that. Lead again. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And leadership is just letting them know what we're for, what we're against, have the backs of our allies and make sure they keep the backs of us. And then anyone that challenges us, call them out. Let them know what we think is wrong. That's all this is just making sure we're changing the culture to showing strength from the United States again, action, and making sure that we show value in the United Nations. I think it's important for the American people.
She points to the tragedy of Syria as a prime example of where the UN could have done more. The human catastrophe continues on an unimaginable and horrifying scale. More than 500,000 killed, nearly 14 million refugees. And Haley says the war could have possibly been avoided had the Security Council taken action. Since the start of the war, Russia has vetoed 6 resolutions in order to protect its ally, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
Do you in part blame the Security Council when it comes to Syria that the war and this horrendous carnage could have been prevented?
Well, I think, the previous administration needs to take responsibility for that as well. I mean, you look at Syria, and it's just gone so far off. I mean, first of all, Assad is he's a war criminal. He's used chemical weapons on his own people. He's not allowing aid to come in. He is very much a deterrent to peace. If you look back, so many things could have been done to prevent where we are today, and that's what we need to focus on now.
Do you blame the Russians and the Russian veto protecting Assad?
I think the Russians and the Iranians have been very much a part of why Assad has had the strength that he's had, and the reason why he's been able to basically hurt his people in the process.
There are reports that the administration will give a, quote, pass to Assad. What's your view of that?
I don't think the administration's given a pass to Assad. Assad is a problem. The administration sees Assad as a problem. But the bigger problem is ISIS. So are we ever going to give a pass to Assad? Absolutely not. Are we ever going to hope that we can bring him to justice and for the people of Syria? Yes. I mean, that's something we have to do. But ISIS, we've got to start dealing with that so that we can bring peace back to the area. And we have to do it by getting the Iranian influence out and moving Assad out of the way.
You also talk about the Security Council and its inability to face some issues. North Korea, for example, continues its nuclear program, continues ballistic missile firing and testing, and China protected North Korea for years in the Security Council.
It all comes down to China. And this is what's going to happen. This administration now is no longer going to take the conversations with China that they're worried too, and they think that that something has to be done. They have to do something.
What type of action would you like to see?
I think China totally has the ability to put sanctions on North Korea. North Korea is dependent financially, militarily, in every way with China. And so if China really wanted to get the attention of North Korea, they have plenty of tools in the toolbox to do that.
When you came, were you surprised at what you found here? You had been a governor. You know how to operate a bureaucracy and agencies. Were you shocked? I was. I was really shocked because I had heard what it was like. But to actually be here and see kind of just, I guess I saw it in South Carolina, but just that same club mentality and doing things a certain way because they'd always been done that way, and the fact that actions had slowed down and, it had gotten stale. And so now to look at it and say, oh, there's a lot of changes we can make, that's what I've done. Well, tomorrow in this hour, 6 p.m. Eastern, we will have part 2 of our interview. She will address the White House efforts to trim the UN budget, and we'll look at what Ambassador Haley says was the biggest surprise she encountered when she arrived at the UN. Said she went to all these meetings in the Mideast, and she said they didn't talk about ISIS or radical Islamic terrorism or Iran, but they criticized Israel.
Back to Mike Pence in Indiana as it happens. In the meantime, let's bring in Glenn Hall, U.S. editor for the Wall Street Journal, joining us from the Journal's headquarters in New York. Always good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Leland.
You have these sort of two competing narratives this weekend. As Kristen Fisher reported, the White House is really trying to get back on message, gain control once again of the story. You've got Mike Pence out in Ohio talking jobs, talking economy in a state they won, and then you have the president this morning tweeting about the fake news media and the phony Russian scandal, as he would call it. Do these work together, or are these sort of working against each other?
It's hard to know. What you see is like the effort to get back on message with the economy. The president signed 2 executive orders yesterday on trade, and you would have thought that was part of a push to get back on message. And then this morning, the tweets steer us back into these other issues that really aren't the ones that they campaigned on, and that they're the promises that they're trying to deliver back to their team. So every week you see both of these things happen. Every week since he's taken office, you see some successes followed by some blunders, or maybe blunders is too strong a word, but things that distract the administration from their goals.
Front page of the Washington Post today, 3 stories probably that the White House is not that happy about. First headline, Trump's agenda getting upstaged. Then Trump's closest aides hail from ranks of financial elite, the financial disclosure story, and then an entire separate story on anti-globalist Bannon, meaning Steve Bannon, got rich as global capitalist. Do these, you think, play in to the president every morning taking to Twitter?
I think when they're trying to get their message out there, the president responds to a lot of different things. He's trying to set his agenda. He's trying to make sure that his narrative isn't being disrupted by narratives that are being pushed forward by other media or by other channels. So, he's taken direct control. It's been his philosophy that he needs to speak directly to the American people through Twitter. And in many cases, it has worked for him, and he's been able to redirect the narrative.
Is that what we're seeing here this morning? You think a little bit of redirection in terms of trying to push away from the Russia scandal, go on the offense where the White House spent so much of this week on defense?
It has been a challenge with this Russia investigation. It continues to be out there, and it's a distraction for sure.
Well, but Glenn, is it a distraction, or is it something more for this White House? When 70 days in, you have somebody who is a senior member of the campaign, then the national security advisor, asking for immunity. Is that merely a distraction, or is that sort of something a little bit more?
Well, I think these are very serious charges that are being investigated, and they create some real possibilities for conflict of interest at the minimum. And so that investigation is going to continue. When I talk about a distraction, I'm referring to how the administration is trying to stay on its message and gets pulled off the message by these various things. The committees in the House and the Senate investigating, the reports that are coming out in the media, all of these things cause their narrative to move in a different direction than they might want it to go.
Where's the Wall Street Journal looking on this? Where are you guys sort of pushing in terms of your coverage as you look forward? 3 world leaders meeting with President Trump this week, Jordan, Egypt, and China as well. We understand, obviously, trying to make this big push on jobs, infrastructure, tax reform, possibly in averting the government shutdown. And then you have, as you would call it, sort of the distraction for the White House of trying to deal with the Russia issue.
Well, one of the things we see is the president, when he's not getting the legislative agenda going the direction he wants it to go, he turns to executive orders to make a point to the people that I am going to do things one way or the other. And I think those trade orders that you saw yesterday are an example of that. But the administration has also said, and working with Paul Ryan and others in the House and Senate, that they want to get tax agenda going now, and they want to get an infrastructure shift going now. So those are part of the promises that they made in the campaign, and I think the president feels very strongly that every week he wants to show progress on all of the promises that he made.
As the Wall Street Journal reported this week, though, the executive orders and the rhetoric on trade has been way dialed down from what we saw during the campaign or even what we saw during the inauguration speech.
Yeah, one of the documents that we saw, and this was an early document, so we don't know the current state of things, it showed that they were not going to be as aggressive at renegotiating NAFTA as had previously been stated by the president, and sort of a dialing back, maybe a practical, pragmatic approach to that. But to be clear, that those were documents that were talking points from early on in the administration, and we don't know yet how the president intends to progress. But we do know, that he's taken some initial steps here with these orders, which basically said, I want you to study trade agreements and tell me if they're working or not, and tell me how they're progressing. I want to look at all of the uncollected tariff fines and so forth for dumping and make sure that we're doing a better job. So, steps, but this is not the big overhaul of NAFTA that was talked about during the campaign.
Yeah, certainly not the ripping up of agreements that we heard the then candidate Trump talk about. Mr. Hall, always good to see you. We'll read about more of your coverage come Monday in the Journal.
Thanks for having me on the show, Leland.
Enjoy the weekend. More on this with Niall Stanage, White House columnist with The Hill. Good to see you as always, sir.
And you, Leland.
We keep hearing from the White House that they want to change the narrative. They do not want to talk about what clearly President Trump calls the fake Trump-Russia story. The question is how they're doing it here. On one end, you have Vice President Pence out there working on Saturday in the heartland, touring a factory where clearly a lot of Trump voters would be working, where his supporters are, where he won in Ohio. And on the other hand, you have the president back here on Saturday morning ahead of the vice president's trip, tweeting about taking on various news organizations. Why don't they ignore this? This is fake news. This is real news. Is this the way to change the narrative?
Well, I think it's more a way to shore up President Trump's base in a way, because the two things that connect those, Leland, is voters who really want jobs, want a real concentration on the kind of heartland interest you're talking about, and voters who believe the media is unfair to President Trump. Now, on that second point, we can debate that all day as to whether the media are or are not unfair, but I think the attacks on the media do serve a political purpose with President Trump's base. Whether they serve that purpose with the wider electorate is a very different question.
Great analysis, Niall. Move on to the second part of Kristen Fisher's story on the financial disclosures. They got put out last night, the typical Friday afternoon document dump. I don't think it surprised anybody that a lot of the folks who the president has surrounded himself are worth a lot of money. And you see these headlines, top here of the Washington Post, Trump's closest aides hail from ranks of financial elite. Do the folks that you were talking about in our first question, the lower income Trump voters who are die-hard devotees of the president, do they care that he's surrounded by millionaires and billionaires, or do they sort of view that as proof of his success?
I think this is a really interesting question and a really interesting issue, Leland, because on the one hand, if those voters were suspicious of wealth, they wouldn't have voted for President Trump in the first place. They clearly vote for him believing that his business acumen is transferable to politics. But when it comes to aides worth hundreds of billions of dollars, I've got to think that if the Trump administration hits a rough patch, people will look at that, people who perhaps feel themselves to be struggling, and think, does a former Goldman Sachs partner really understand what I'm going through?
Well, and you have to wonder if the president's political appointees, Democrats especially come 2018, are going to say, hey, look, to working class Americans in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, how can the president understand your plight when he's surrounded by these people? I want to bring this back to the issue of what the president calls the Obama surveillance scandal, the unmasking of these names that were caught up in surveillance, and conceivably they, at least reportedly, were unmasked by someone fairly senior inside the Obama administration. What are you hearing from inside the White House? Are his advisors really pushing this narrative, or is this being pushed by the president himself?
I think it's a combination of both. I mean, the White House clearly believes that there was some underhanded behavior by members of the Obama administration or former members. Now, the difficulty they face is that that behavior does not equate to what President Trump originally tweeted, which was President Obama personally wiretapping him. But certainly they believe that there has been a push to disseminate damaging information about this administration in a way that cuts across usual practice.
Well, and they certainly seem like the Obama surveillance scandal, as the president calls it, is an anecdote, or perhaps at least muddies the water when it comes to the Russia investigation going on up on the Hill. Niall, always great to have your analysis, sir. Good to be with you.